because he'd want to see what we were actually talking about. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is an offshoot of what I had discussed at ISIP. I don't want to go all the way back to the discussion, though, do I? What I had discussed in Edinburgh this summer. And what I had talked about in Edinburgh was kind of some broad complexity theory terminology. And I had related at the end to a concept that Tim and I have been throwing around for the past 6 months. We term it the movement conversation. And we actually have one article that just got published in Quest dealing with the movement conversation. We have a second article that goes into a much more deep, and it's being reviewed by Kinesiology Review at this point. Those are highly theoretical papers. They don't have a lot of data. And at this point, Tim and I are moving towards gathering data to kind of support our claims. So what this presentation is going to do is it's going to kind of lay out the claim, and it's going to give you a little bit of our preliminary data with some caveats. It's not a high-end sample that we have so far. We're moving into more high-end samples, but it kind of lays out what we're looking at, and it kind of illustrates this idea of the movement conversation. Okay, so what do we mean specifically by the movement conversation? If you look at the term conversation, it's just a formal or informal exchange of thoughts through spoken word. And what we mean by the movement conversation, we borrow from this definition and replace spoken words with movement patterns. And so essentially our definition of the movement conversation is the formal or informal exchange of ideas through movement patterns. And this is an interesting concept. If I just tell somebody this, they say, well, how does that work? And there are some fairly good theoretical backings for this to occur. And I'm going to lay some of those out. Okay, so if we look, if students are creating motor solutions or movement solutions through their physical activity, this could be conceptualized as a framework for a discussion. And there possibly, if we could conceptualize mimicry, or students mimicking each other's motor patterns during physical education, this could be considered some type of exchange through a visual medium, a visual and other, maybe a kinesthetic perceptual medium. And so if we look at these motor solutions and how they come about within the learning environment, then we can start to understand kind of how this discussion may occur. The big concept that relates directly to this group is that students generally can be conceived as operating as complex adaptive systems. So over time, by themselves in isolation, even if in isolation, interacting with their environment and the task and constraints within inside themselves, we can see that they are going to self-organize and produce emergent behaviors or emergent motor patterns. And those emergent motor patterns will work towards what, in complexity theory, we talk about are attractor states. These attractor states within motor patterns are going to tend to be more efficient motor patterns. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are always going to be efficient, but it does mean that they are going to have something within that ecological niche that's going to make them stick, something that's going to make them stick within that attractor well. And so if we look at it this way, students are automatically going to be producing these emergent motor patterns. And if we look at mimicry or an exchange between students, if they are exchanging these motor patterns individually developed, and if they can mimic those exchanged motor patterns, then we could see this is the beginning of possibly a discussion. So if we look at the environment as impacting these attractor states. The other students within the learning environment also impact these attractor states. They actually become part of the learning environment. So if we look at this, we can conceptualize that mimicry might happen. Some type of mimicry or quasi-mimicry situation could happen. If you look in the physical education literature, nobody has looked at this. There's no research on mimicry. It's just one of those things that hasn't been looked at a lot. So what would we call this mimicry? We could call it spontaneous social synchronization. We could call it non-conscious mimicry. Some people have called it the chameleon effect. Now, all three of these terms are well established within social psychology. So physical educators haven't examined this, but social psychologists have looked at this extensively, and they've looked at it within the laboratory environment quite a bit. And it's well observed, it's well quantified, and it's established within that discipline. So from that framework, we now have a basis to say, yeah, mimicry probably is happening in physical education. It just hasn't been quantified and it hasn't been adequately observed within physical education. So if we have that basis to say there is non-conscious mimicry or a chameleon effect happening between the students, well, maybe a discussion is occurring here, and maybe there is a cumulative product being developed between two students that are simply in contact with each other, simply paired together within a classroom environment. So if we look at a chameleon really quick, and we conceptualize a chameleon and its colors as motor patterns. Now, this is a very reductionist view, and I fully admit that right now, but I just want to point out some of the key concepts of this idea of a chameleon effect among physical education students. So if we look at the chameleon adapts to its environment through emergent motor, not emergent motor patterns, but emergent patterns, and it can blend into its environment. This would be an attractor state. The attractor state allows it to camouflage itself, and it now doesn't have to worry too much about getting eaten by predators. The problem is when we introduce another chameleon. So now the chameleon not only has to deal with the branch it's on, but it also is interacting with another chameleon. So it has this relationship not only with the branch or the environment, but it also has a relationship with the other chameleon. So we might see something like this. One chameleon takes one thing on from the other one takes another thing on. Eventually they come to a common solution, and they may even come up with something that allows them to blend into their environment a little bit more. Now, from a complexity point of view, we know that a system not only will be influenced by the environment, but will also influence the environment. So this may be something that we would conceptualize as happening, but definitely would not happen. So we see that this is a very, very simple view of a conversation that has happened between two entities based on a mimicked relationship. Okay, so within social psychology, we found a few things that mediate this mimicry or discussion. And typically these are one-way interactions. We have one mimicker and one mimicked person. And we see these factors have been repeatedly shown to either amplify or dampen this non-conscious or chameleon effect. And essentially we see that affiliation or pre-existing rapport, desire to affiliate, mood, or even romantic entanglements tend to affect non-conscious mimicry within people engaged in an activity. Affiliation has been found to be one of the major ones. Rapport has been found to be another major one. Desire to affiliate is another one. What's really interesting about romantic entanglements is they've actually found that people that are romantically entangled with somebody not in the situation will actually anti-mimic. They speculate this is because they are protecting their romantic relationship and the affiliation they have with that person. They don't want to establish the one with another one. Mood is another one. People that tend to be in good moods non-consciously mimic more than people that are in bad moods. People that are angry don't mimic as much. Now, the big thing that we would like to be able to do is have a physical education teacher promote this conversation. If the conversation that we're talking about is beneficial, if the students can come up with a common motor sequence, or not necessarily a common motor sequence, but common motor solutions that work for them as individuals, then that may be an advantageous state for our students to be in. So we would like the teachers to be able to come up with some type of instructional strategy by which to amplify this behavior. So if we look at the possibilities for this, one would be, well, let's go through the classroom and pair the students based on these factors that social psychology has made. Okay, so we could go through, we could look at their moods, we could see who wants to affiliate, who has pre-existing rapport, all of those things. That concept, it looks good. It feels good to say, okay, we can do this. However, if you look at the feasibility of it, it is nowhere near feasible, and most of those factors are highly fluid. Moods change from day to day, friendships change from day to day, romantic entanglements change from day to day. All of these things really are in flux. The big thing that we see from this is that some of them are mutually exclusive. So you don't have to have a single way direction or single way interaction or mimicry. You can actually have bi-way mimicry, and that's really what we're looking at. So another way of looking at this is not necessarily relying on the student factors in and of themselves, but having a teaching strategy that actually encourages these factors amongst all the students. And one way we have thought about, for instance, curricular models. If we look at sport education has the specific directive to establish rapport and affiliation between people on those individual teams. So instead of pairing individual students, maybe we pair teams that are made up of different motor competencies, but within that team structure, we are building towards a need to affiliate or a need to develop rapport among those students. And through that development, we should see this movement conversation emerge within those larger groups. Another one that Tim has been working on is this concept of modification by adaptation. And again, this looks at building rapport between students by fostering different motor competencies to be able to compete within two-sided games in an equitable fashion. And so we think that possibly modification by adaptation may do this too. But these are just two examples of how we may be able to foster this physical conversation between students in a more meaningful way than having to go through and just pair them based on arbitrary factors that have been determined by either social psychologists or us eventually through some of our research. So that's where we are right now with determining kind of where can we look for this. Now, some of the preliminary research, which I briefly showed in Scotland, I'm going to go over, and this is going to take a bit to explain. But we looked at a very simple example of synchronization. Synchronization and mimicry are highly correlated. In fact, they believe that some of the same physiological responses are responsible for both synchronization as well as mimicry. So it seems like a plausible place to start. And what we did was we filmed people dribbling together. And we initially started with college students, and we only had 7 in the initial study, which I'm going to show you today. The second study, we had 85 elementary students with a combination of 233 overall pairings. For this study, we only had 7 participants. And what we did was we used a thing called optical flow analysis. It essentially gave us motion signals for the 2 students, and then it allowed us to correlate those motion signals. So the first hints of this discussion come through these 2 types of graphs. The first one up here, you'll see this is a rate diagram. So this is looking at what is the dribbling rate. And this is essentially dribbles per second. So in this one, this person is dribbling about 2 dribbles per second. The second one actually looks at two people. So it's looking at two of these graphs and combining them into a correlational map here. And this just tells us how correlated the two students were at 0 time. And I'll get into that a little bit here in a second. I need to erase this. If I don't erase these, they will come up on the next slide. And so if we look at a dribbling rate, so we had our students in this experiment dribble over a total of 60 seconds. We can see here that their dribbling rate was about the same as we saw in the previous graph. It was about two dribbles every second. And for instance, here we can see there was a brief escalation where they went up to maybe 0.6 instead of 0.5. So basically fairly steady along the line. Here's our second participant. We see that initially this participant had a fair amount of inconsistency, and then right about 20 seconds they became steady for one reason or another. So that was interesting from our point of view. You guys see my my mouse? Okay. So if we look here at the combined, so these are dribbling comparisons. If we look at the dribbling comparisons here, so this is both of those rate graphs put together. Correlational values, the red, high red is close to a +1, which means they're almost dribbling at the same rate or on the exact same time. And a -1 meaning they're completely opposite at that point. So if we look here, we can see a point where they were not correlated at all, meaning they were not synchronized. And then we see a position of about 40 seconds where they completely synchronized. So this is an indication that they did synchronize after 20 seconds. And what is interesting about this is not just simply the same rate. They are actually synchronizing at the 0 time span. So if they were dribbling at different rates and then came into synchronization, they may be one after another. So you may actually have like a second lag. So it would be ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. And you would actually see it up here. You wouldn't see the correlation at this 0. It would actually be a little bit up. You would actually see the lag in there. This indicates that they actually were dribbling at the exact same time at the exact same rate. So it was boom, 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 not ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. We do see that they came out right about there, but overall they're fairly consistent right there after this initial 20 seconds. Now, if we actually look at all three of these graphs together, we can see the first person here. Remember, they are fairly solid. They had a little bump right there. Here, the second person, their rate changed right about there, and they came back in. And then here we see the non-synchronized and then the synchronized. If we actually correlate these, we see that during this first time, the second participant, they were out of sync during that time. The second participant actually came into sync and synchronized with the first participant at this point. And again, this isn't simply dribbling at the same rate. They actually changed their rate, and at the same, not the same rate necessarily, but the same rate at the same time. They were identical. It was boom, 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 boom. The next thing that we see is that bump we've seen on the first participant right here. We actually see that come through down here on their correlations. So this person actually influenced the overall correlation by coming out of sync. Now, what is really interesting about this is it had no effect on the second participant. What this means is that this person came out of sync here, and they came back not only to the same rate, but the same timing as well. Okay, that means they weren't just a ba-dump, ba-dump, they came back to the bump, bump, bump. This is an exchange between the two people. The two people exchanged here and they exchanged here. We also have a minor one here where this student changed a little bit, where participant 1 did not change, and we have another indication down here on the correlational map. These are preliminary indications that we had some type of synchronization that occurred. Not only did we have synchronization, but we had them come out of phase and then come back into phase. And not only at the same rate, but at the exact same timing, right at that 0 lag position. This means that they were actually, I would speculate, communicating. Now, we had all 7 participants, which had several deviations. I believe we had 21 deviations of that. And this pattern resulted several different times. We did statistical testing on it, and you can see we didn't do just statistical testing between these pairings. What we did was we artificially paired them together. So we had individual trials with each one of these, and we actually paired them individually together, and we tested those against the actual pairings, and we found that there were significant differences between when they were paired together and when they weren't paired together. So it has nothing to do with rate. It actually has to do with an exchange. And like Tim and I have been talking about, this really has nothing to do with motor patterns at this point. But it does give us a hint that there is an underlying discussion that is occurring by some type of non-conscious mimicry or chameleon effect at this point. So at this point, I would say this does present something of evidence for the underlying movement discussion occurring between these students. The next step is to actually look at a very large sample of these same type of data. And then the next step after that is to actually go in and look at discrete skills. So can we actually identify discrete motor patterns between two partners and discern how those emerge, what happens with them, what happens, for instance, when you put 2 people into a movement conversation and one has high motor competency and one has low motor competency. How does that exchange result? Does it actually diminish some of the product of the person with the higher motor competency? Does it actually bring the person with the lower motor competency up? And some of our research with modification by adaptation seems to indicate that we may be able to work that out and even the playing field for both players in such a way that they can exchange on a more equitable in a more equitable way. Okay, so that is where we're at. And essentially at this point, I'm really just looking for your guys' input, your critical assessment of what we've done, and then understanding if we're kind of on the right track, and what you think of the overall research. Hey, Mike's here.
Okay.
Did you catch the very end?
You've got your microphone muted, Mike.
You're all unmute you, Mike. It's not letting me unmute. There we go. Mike, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Now we can hear you. Yep.
Cool.
Okay. So does anybody want to start?
I just think it's really interesting, Jesse. You know, it's a really nice, you know, at the moment I'm going to say it's a nice metaphor in which to frame the sort of the interaction and improvisation that goes on in a movement situation. But I'll just see if there's any other questions that come up. I've got a few things just to ask here.
One of the criticisms that I did get, I would say it's critique in Edinburgh, was behaviorists, that they thought we were coming from more of a behaviorist point of view. I think we've tried to break away from that a little bit. in that we aren't saying that necessarily we have a stimulus that is creating a behavior so much as we have emergent behavior that is being transmitted or at least learned in a different way through the movement conversation.
One of the questions that I had was, say, as you go forward, do you have any data of them after going into synchronization, but not being with a peer? So then they're not. So what I'm trying to look at there is you're suggesting that because they're in a group situation that they're synchronizing with that, and my question, my sort of answer, well, my question that I've got in my mind is: are they synchronizing with a partner, or have they discovered that attractor state that's the most efficient?
Yeah.
And so will they vary from that? Are they varying out and then coming back to what's the most efficient pattern, or are they actually mimicking somebody else? And I think, to verify or determine that, you almost need to take them away from their partner again to see if if they go out of sync, so to speak, because they're not watching somebody else.
And what's interesting about the study that I just showed you guys was we didn't pair them sequentially. So they had a pairing, but so I would be with partner A for the first trial, but then I would switch to partner B for the second trial. I would go with partner C for a third trial, and eventually I would come back to partner A. And so then we put them all together. And what you see is they do synchronize with different people. And what's funny is when you pull those and you look at, so for instance, partner A that I synchronized with and partner B that I didn't synchronize with, partner A and B, may have synchronized. So what you're saying about those attractor states, it didn't flash out in the data. And what we did was we did individual trials as well. So instead of just having them dribble together paired, we actually took them and had them dribble individually. And the whole point behind that was to see, do they have a natural pattern that they're dribbling in? Do they naturally dribble in this specific way? And we found that there were significant differences between what they did alone and what they did with those partners. So this would indicate that they are changing their dribbling pattern based on who they are partnered with. And that's not to say that everybody synchronized. It did tend to be that people that dribbled at the same rate. For instance, I think the people we showed were 0.5s, right? If you had a person that dribbled at a 0.7, those people are almost never synchronized with the 0.5s. And the speculation would be that it's too much of a change to non-consciously mimic that. Because 0.7 and 0.5 the timing is fairly significantly different there. So it would be too much for them to not notice that they were changing their synchronization at that point. We did find an interesting thing tied back to the romantic entanglements. I had two girls in the class that were engaged at the time, and they did not synchronize with anybody. Even people, and they were like a 0.5, so they should have synchronized with somebody, but they did not synchronize with anybody. And I think that goes back to the social psychology literature that said that they were probably protecting their relationship at that point. So it's interesting. I mean, that doesn't really play into what we are doing in the elementary setting, but it does show that there are certain factors that go into this that have started to pop out.
How did you think about the concept of constraints? Do you think that has an impact here? Because you haven't talked about constraints, and if self-organization is essentially or emergences that are related to the self-organization within constraints or constrained situations.
Yeah.
You're bringing in a different dynamic.
Yeah. Within dribbling, the constraints are going to be fairly light. You have some learner constraints based on their previous experience. The gymnasium constraints were fairly controlled for. They were all dribbling on the same floor. They were dribbling, they were dribbling the same basketballs. We never even got the same coefficient of restitution for each of the basketballs. But the constraints at this point with synchronization aren't as important, I'm looking at the emergence really at the individual level of, really it's learner constraints at that point. What is their previous experience? What is emerging based on that previous experience, and how is that previous experience affecting their partner? I think that's, at this point, that's what we're really focusing on. Once we move into discrete skill mimicry, then I think we're going to have to take those constraints into consideration much more. Because while this was not in the laboratory, it was not a true physical education environment. It did not have as much ecological validity as, for instance, if we were actually looking at them playing basketball within the gymnasium. That's going to be much different. There's going to be a lot more stuff that comes into that.
Right. So, got lots of things going about in my head. And I missed the first bit, so if I'm getting this wrong, so what are you trying to prove is the wrong word? What are you? Let me say what I'm taking, and then you come back at me. If everybody synchronizes, that would be an argument against self-organization, because everyone basically is copying somebody else. What you've said there is a lot of people didn't synchronize. So basically, there is something in here that in certain situations between certain people who, and actually going back to Alan's constraint point, given certain constraints in position, they are more likely to synchronize than others. And therefore, they are more, they are more ready or more available to synchronize than the other people, for a range of different reasons. That could be, in this sense, emotional, as you've highlighted, but could also be physical. In that, you know, if I try to get in sync with Michael Johnston or Larry Bird, it's not going to actually, no, it probably would happen. I think that's Alan running away, is it? So I would just, what, from a complexity perspective, what are you trying to show? I think that's the bit I'm still trying to work out.
So,
did that make sense?
Yeah, and to be honest, from a synchronization point of view, I'm not that interested in synchronization. I'm really interested in the idea of exchange between students through a non-conscious mode. And so mimicry is really what we're looking at. And I would say that not everybody mimics equally. And you're absolutely right. Some people don't mimic at all. But what social psychology has told us is that affiliation and rapport are going to be two really powerful things to get people to mimic each other. And complexity theory comes in that idea that we have task, environmental, and learner constraints. And typically, we produce emergent motor patterns based upon those three levels of constraints. Environmental is going to be one of those major constraints that we are producing emergent behaviors based on. Now, within a paired situation, the partner that you're with not only is just a partner, they are actually a part of the learning environment. So now they have actually become a constraint on you. So them simply doing that action within your environment is now going to influence your motor patterns, your motor behaviors. And that would lay down the basis for synchronization or mimicry over time. And where it comes in is, where it becomes important for us is not necessarily mimicry. If one person mimics another, I don't really care about that too much. What I want is one student to mimic another, and then that student to mimic them. And through that mimicry, the first person actually gets a little bit of their own mimicry back, and they start working out this solution back and forth as part of each other's environmental constraints. And through this, they work down the pathway towards those attractor wells, and they come up with this emergent product. This emergent product, which should be more efficient, could be within, whenever we talk about attractors within complexity theory, they actually may be, when we look at possibly bad habits would be a good example of an attractor that's not necessarily the most efficient. There is a reason that it became an attractor, but essentially that's what I'm really interested in, how the students work down that well towards that attractor. And through mimicry, if we can get them to do this back and forth mimicry, we should be able to get them down that attractor well in a more efficient pattern, more efficient way than if they were individual. And so if we can come up with teaching methods or curriculum methods that would promote this, it's my contention that you're going to have two effects. You're going to have, one, they're going to learn faster, and two, they're going to enjoy the activity because they have a higher sense of self-efficacy because they have learned at a faster rate.
Yeah. So as they come together, so from a complexity perspective, they are neither. So complexity in terms of self-organization would say that self-organization happens, but it is de facto neither good or bad. It happens. Yeah. And in context, it can be good or it can be bad.
Yes.
And therefore we get situations where people come together and become gangs and do things that we would fundamentally say are not good because they start to mimic each other and they dress the same way and. Yep. So therefore, your argument, which I completely get, is that in that social learning situation, we want to find out what are the in a sense, the methods that we can start to look, so that instead of us being the person, so the traditional behaviorist way is you've got to do what I tell you, you've got to copy me, you've got to mimic me, so and therefore it's a move into something that's much more collaborative. It's much more about peer learning, but it's then what would we have to do? Because I would still take the point that if I tried to copy Alan as a basketball player doing dribbling, I would probably end up giving up because he is much better at me, much better at me. So there's a whole cycle. Going back to Al's point, there are so many constraints that become part of the makeup. And as we go through our life, we meet people in these different situations on a regular basis. And it's here. So I think I'm starting to get where you coming from. And the negative argument could be, which I'm not presenting, okay, is that this could be that if you put people together, they will mimic each other. Actually, that's not true. You put people together and some people will mimic each other. And that could be a collaborative mimic, but it could also be a disconnect or a whatever it is, an unrelated mimicking.
And okay, so two major points there. This is good. This is helpful. I'm going to write these down really quick. So if you look at okay, so you made a really good metaphor there with gangs and how gangs self-organize. And within society, we actually have a check for that. We have police and district attorneys. So if you look at a teacher, and let's say that the students...
And presidents.
yeah, we have presidents, yeah. Some presidents are criminals. Anyways, so you have a teacher that they are going to set up that learning environment in such a way, if they can set it up to promote mimicry. And like you said, some people aren't going to mimic each other. And even if they try to mimic each other, they're going to be frustrated. And this is key for our teachers to get involved. And this is what whenever I talk to a teacher out in the school, they're always like, well, we're not important now because we're not teaching. And I always tell them, no, you are important. You're actually more important. You're just differently important than you think you are. And so what their role really is to guide the students through this learning process through grouping them correctly. Or like Tim's working on with his modification by adaptation game, what his games would do is he would put Mike with Alan And within that game structure, it would actually equal out their ability to where they could play, it would modulate their abilities to where Alan could play at his high level and Mike could play at his lower level, and they could still be.
Oh, no, sorry, you misunderstood. I'm much better than Alan. No, no, no. Sorry.
Okay, excellent. But modification by adaptation really looks at that. How do we get them to collaborate together? How do we create affiliation and rapport between two individuals that may not necessarily meet up? And modification by adaptation seems to be a mode by which we can do that. I know Joanne, you in your work with Tim, he probably outlined that quite a bit. How we can actually modulate that and get them to work together. I have one more point. One thing with Mike with the good or bad. So yes, self-organization and emergence has no good or bad. However, we know that there are bad habits within motor patterns. And that's, again, where the teacher comes in to give corrective feedback. And feedback is kind of one of those things that now this teacher, I envision it as that corrective feedback actually becomes part of the environmental constraint. That through that corrective feedback, we can try to push those students out of that bad habit well and over into something that's a little bit more efficient. Now, that's not saying that we know exactly what that pattern is, but for instance, with baseball, I'll illustrate that. So with baseball, a lot of times we have people that swing the bat, and then they let go with their left hand. Now that reduces power of the bat, it reduces accuracy, it reduces the whole thing. But for some reason, that's an attractor. It's something where people go to all the time. That's something that could be guided. So if we see them working towards that and people mimicking that behavior, we could make some type of intervention. I don't know quite what we would do, but we could make an intervention to try to get them to, well, you got to keep that left hand on the bat as it goes through. Something, but that would be one of those examples of how we could try to mediate a bad habit that is emerging within their individual groupings. And that's kind of what I was going with the gang thing. We tend to try to mediate gang behavior through our justice system. I hate to equate teachers to that, but if we look at it, that's kind of what I would equate it to in that perspective. Did I hit everything that you kind of? Okay. And I like what you brought up with the collaboration. Through their collaboration, they're actually producing a better collaborative solution than they could have come up with individually. And the teacher is very important there. They have to be able to pair either students or group them in a certain way as to create this conversation, or they have to create a learning environment through modification by adaptation or sport education that fosters some of these factors that we know go into non-conscious mimicry. Louise.
Jesse, yeah. I would like to follow through for Mike's first comments.
Okay.
And I think that when you said that there's no good or bad in relation to the movement conversation, I do not know if that's the way that Tim are going in his work with the colleague that I just forgot her name here. Nesta?
Okay.
Okay. But I think that there's something to think about in relation to the aftermath of the data that you showed. Thinking about what teachers could do in terms of strategy. And when you said that there is no good or bad, I think that if you remove the context, you need to have some criteria, or at least one criterion, to state which is which fetus, which action, which movement or pattern would fit that context in a more adequate way. So I understood that there is no good or bad, but for Yasser Daka, for this piece of research, you kind of remove the context. And I got thinking that in the chameleon analogy, the chameleons, they tend to adapt to the environment, to the context,
Yeah.
and it's also related to the Merleau-Ponty's perspective on when you have to choose between yourself or the world, the environment. You need to choose the environment because the environment is what is supposed to make you more human or more creative.
Okay.
In this case, thinking about the context of basketball, and Mike said, well, if you had Larry Bird or Michael Jordan together, or himself and Helen, if we have those students, they dribbling at the same time and trying to have this conversation, the exchange, in the basketball environment, in the context of basketball playing the game, we do have two balls, so they do need to adjust in different conditions. So my question would be, that's not the case that you could try, or you or perhaps Tim, to try to see if since they can, or some of them, they can adjust, they can synchronize their patterns in the context of basketball playing, when they play perhaps against each other. They can anticipate as a defender something that the person with the ball could do because the students already know how to cope with that if both of them had a ball. But in the context of basketball playing, they would have at least two different positions. So the question is, if you consider another step in the research, trying to see what would happen in the context of a physical education class, because you said in the beginning of your presentation that perhaps teachers' strategies would be better if they use some of those data.
Yep.
It got a little confused, but the main point is that if you think about the aftermath of using the data.
Okay. Really quick. Just a second. Okay, so really quick, good versus bad. I will say that within nature, there is a good versus bad in self-organization. If we look at how the world self-organizes, that typically good is efficient. That's not always the case, but efficiency tends to be one of those pushers towards attractor wells, and bad tends to be not. However, okay, that's neither here nor there. With your suggestion about actually looking at within the ecological context, that is our next experiment. That's the one we're actually setting up right now. We are actually looking at Tim's handball game, or actually, what's he called it? He calls it wall ball, I think. Not team handball. It's actually, I can't remember what he calls it. He calls it a handball game. But anyways, it's modification by adaptation. And essentially within that frame, we are actually going and collecting data. Data in those contexts are much more difficult to analyze. The data that I gave you was very easy to collect. It was very easy to analyze. It only takes maybe an hour or two to actually go through and look at those things and those patterns, and then do the quantitative analysis. With games in the context, we actually have to go through and code, do reliability analysis, and we have to collect a lot of data because it's a discrete skills that we're looking at as opposed to rhythmic activities. So within the next one, we're actually going to look at handball and modification by adaptation. We're actually going to see how those students affect each other's motor behaviors during gameplay, how if we can look at some of those motor patterns and how they transition between students and between groupings as they move. And we're doing this at the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade level. We're collecting data on about 90 students, and we should be able to see if we're actually testing the difference between modification by adaptation or a direct traditional instructional model. And so we're going to have two groups. It's going to have about, how many do we have in both? We have about 40 people in both groups. And we're going to see if we can actually pull out some of those data. And that's what's actually going to be meaningful. Do these contexts that we set up, do they actually allow for this movement conversation to occur? And what happens during this movement conversation? We're also testing what is their motor achievement. So do they actually improve their skills during the class? And then do they improve their enjoyment of that activity? Is the enjoyment of the modification by adaptation game better than the traditional direct model? Do they have more mimicry during the modification by adaptation as opposed to the direct model? And do they actually improve their skills better during that modification by adaptation as opposed to the direct instructional model? So that is where we're going. This is just kind of an initial look. Did I answer your question? Slightly?
Yes, you did. Yes, you did.
Yeah, and see, the synchronization data, it's interesting, and it definitely tells us that something is probably there. Beyond that, it doesn't have a lot of utility. I can't go into the classroom and say, oh yeah, you synchronize with you. That doesn't tell me anything important. It doesn't tell me if the students are learning. It doesn't tell me if the students are enjoying the activity any better. It doesn't tell me if they're learning better than they would at some other model, or if that discussion wasn't occurring. To really get at the heart of that, we have to go in and identify those discrete skills that they're possibly mimicking or coming up with, those collaborative products that are going on, and then we have to kind of see how do those fit into the overall enjoyment and achievement within physical activity. Anybody else?
I was just going to come back to, it's interesting because we're talking mainly about mimicry, and maybe that's what you wanted to talk about, whereas you started with the notion of conversation. And,
well, I conceptualize mimicry as a conversation.
Okay.
The whole idea is that mimicry is an exchange, and it is an exchange of motor patterns. And so if you look at it in that way, it does constitute a conversation, I would say, especially
Right.
if you're going back and forth during that conversation.
I suppose the only other thing that might be worth exploring in that is the social dynamics, like a conversation like it's happening here. You know, some people feel that they can speak, other people feel that maybe they can't speak. There's all of that sort of reflexivity going on about, being able to understand the rules in the situation, the social rules in the situation. And so I'm just wondering, especially as kids run around on a gym, and especially playing basketball, is there some perception going on about, I'm paired up with Jesse. Now, Jesse's a good basketball player, so I'm sort of going to copy him, and then because I'm not very good and he's really good. There's those sort of social dynamics that could possibly also influence what's happening, which is what you kind of implicitly sort of said, look, this is one way around, we could actually pair players up, pair kids up so that mimicry actually happens. But that's why I like the notion of a conversation, because mimicry happens in a verbal conversation. There's probably people looking and nodding, and there's all of those sorts of things happen at the same time. So it's probably a really nice concept, nice metaphor to use.
Actually, the literature on that says that right now, all of us are more than likely mimicking something. Even through video, we are more than likely mimicking or imitating certain portions of what we see. And it's seen as more of a facilitation of conversation. It's one of those things we do to kind of smooth out conversation between each other. So yeah.
Yeah. So, and I
In
think,
the
yes,
case of Mike, it's literally half of what we are seeing.
Yeah.
oh, true, yeah. And I think mimicry, especially in the motor field, you just know how powerful it is. Advertising, um, you know, jumps on that notion of affiliation. David Beckham wears these sort of boots, so I want those sort of boots.
Yeah, exactly. And they actually did some research on sales where they looked at salespeople, and they looked to see who would mimic. If you mimicked your client, if that improved your chances of sale. And they actually did find that if you were mimicking, that you had a higher chance of making those sales. And then they had things like, was the salesperson attractive? And they actually looked at the mimicry of the customer. And if they weren't very attractive, the customer would anti-mimic them, and they definitely would not make the sale. It was a lot of cool stuff with this that goes into social psychology.
Right. And so that's where I think it'd just be really interesting to see, in addition to like that quantitative data, as you said, like the students does it, what other non-conscious things, and that's why I call it, that reflexive reading of the situation, understanding the rules in the situation, going into that notion of habitus and field, understanding and learning what the field is, what are the rules in this situation, and does mimicry actually facilitate me cutting through some of that problem solving? Mm-hmm. I'll just copy Jesse's, in a really brute way. I know a lot of my students don't listen to the rules, the instructions, but then as soon as you say, okay, away you go, they all look around and find out who was listening. What are we supposed to be doing?
Yeah, exactly.
And they'll copy them. Mimicry happens at that sort of social level, as well as the even though it's related to, driving the motor behavior.
Awesome.
Anyway, there's a few people who haven't spoken yet. We need to get a few more reactions.
Anybody else want to chime in?
I might say something.
Awesome.
Mimicry is certainly very important, and I really like the movement conversation. But the level of mimicry is also important to discuss. Is it to mirror the action in itself, or is it more like a general behavior, for instance, in basketball or volleyball? I usually want to have a poor or less experienced to play with, or in 2-2, to in a warm-up, so that they can kind of mirror the one that is better. But we know that from dynamic system theory point of view, that a lot of different actions can give the same result. What's your thought about that in this mimicry?
I think that actually points out some of the positives. So when you're talking about motor solutions, that they may be different motor solutions that give us the same result, I think from a mimicry standpoint, this is really a great advantage. You may have a student that is in a group situation where they're actively being promoted to mimic each other through this movement conversation. And a person may have previous experience where they actually bring that in. I know in one of our experiments, we had looked at beanbag throwing, and one of the students had, we actually looked at beanbag throwing with a paddle. So they had to balance the beanbag on the paddle and then throw it to a target. And this was among second grade students. So right off the bat, they're going to have balance problems with that racket. And they all had balance problems, except one student. It wasn't during that day. He had learned this previous somehow. he came in and he used his index finger, gripped the paddle like this, and held the beanbag on the paddle with the index finger and was able to fling it towards the target. And so through the first and the second round, we had students that were trying to do this. Some of them would be successful. And then they saw him doing that action. And then almost entirely on the third round, everybody was doing that same action. So they had actually figured out a solution to a problem. Now they had a solution. During that first 2 rounds, they had kind of figured out, hey, if I balance it a little bit better here, then maybe I can get it there. But he had actually brought that other solution in that was completely novel, that they would be able to easily replicate. And they were very, very successful after that. And what's interesting is some of them still did use the previous, because they had some success with it and they were able to balance. But their learner constraints played heavily into that. Sometimes they weren't able to do that balancing act. They were never successful, so they had to use that finger. And some of them, not a lot, were very good at that whole balancing thing, and they were still able to do that. And it had some of its advantages. When you use the finger, it slows the beanbag down, so you have to compensate for it. You can't throw it as fast, you can't throw it as far. So there were things that slowed it down. It didn't become as efficient, but they were able to stably do it. So that's where I would see the major benefit of mimicry being that, yeah, we can work on a collaborative product, but people can bring in their own experiences from what they're doing, and completely different tasks can be worked through, and those attractor wells can be worked on between the 2 students. Did I adequately answer your question?
Yeah, in a way.
Okay.
I want to take this a little bit further, because if you mimic, you're kind of in pairs and you should mimic or mirror the other one. But I really like the expression of movement conversation when 3 or more have to work together. For instance, a receiver in volleyball, a setter and a smasher, they have to communicate movementally to each other, when to start, when to, and to let students experience the relationship in the movement together.
Yep.
You have to depend on a kind of movement conversation in order to do that. And sometimes I grab them by hand, the students, and to learn them how to have the instep in the smashing, so they can learn from my moves in a way. That's totally different, but to let them experience a receive, a set, and a smash in together, and feel this movement together, that's very important. And to have the meta knowledge about this movement conversation, I think is also very important for students.
Yep, and there's actually some Brazilian research on corner kicks in soccer, and they had actually looked. I think it may have been penalty kicks. I'm trying to think of it right, but it essentially looked at the exact same thing you were talking about, the synchronization between the kicker and his teammates, and how they handle those situations. And they looked at synchronization between 2 or more people. And when we talk about this verbal conversation, the easiest way that I conceptualize it is a dyad. However, it could be a triad or more than 2 or 3 people. And that's where it becomes very interesting. And what you just explained, where you have that high level of ecological validity, where you have 3 or more people playing in a game situation that are exchanging information non-consciously. That is where it becomes very interesting. And even within that example, so the set smash, the bump set smash, or pass set smash between 3 people in volleyball, let's say. We can have them practice that. They can do that communication. But then once we put them in a game situation, that may completely break down that communication, or it may amplify it. We need to look at that. That's definitely a form of non-conscious. I wouldn't say it's mimicry, because they're not actually replicating movements, but they are communicating and it's non-conscious or just barely conscious that they are communicating, because there's certain things that go on during those very quick actions that it possibly is not that it is not conscious, that they're doing certain things that they aren't necessarily conscious of, and they are communicating through that structure. So that's definitely a way that we need to look at this.
I think there's quite a lot mimicking in that as well.
Okay.
They are not reproducing the same actions, but they are reproducing the rhythm, mimicking the rhythm.
Yes, you're right. You're right.
And the rhythm, along with these three players in this action, is utmost important to have the feeling of that they are doing something together.
You're right. I wasn't thinking about it like that. I was thinking about it in discrete skills. But when you look at it that way, that is very important.
And that's why I said that we have to look at this in different levels, if you know what I mean.
Yes, yes. Now I'm getting.
You can see it from one level, but if you go further down, you will find that they are probably mimicking each other in the way of responding to each other, looking, facial expressions, the rhythm of the body, how to set the first foot, how to behave their arms to show that they are ready.
Awesome. Yes.
Lot of communication there.
Yep.
Can I just ask, or Jesse, you just say, just in the context of this discussion you've just been having, that you said it's work as a collaborative project that different people bring different things to the table.
Yep.
And does it then depend on what, let's just call it the learning intention is? So the teacher, and in your case, you're doing some research and you're reasonably clear about what the intention is of what you want the two participants to do, which is bounce a basketball in terms of what we saw. But that conversation, so if the conversation is greatly constrained, as you say, to a specific, discrete, technical movement in a certain way, that's quite different than if the learning intention or the intention is something that is more open, because that's very specific. Now, in the real world, it's more often open than very closed, or the way the real world works is really open. So in my head, the idea of the conversation, and in terms of the idea of the word mirroring was used. So there's something about, in certain contexts, when the intention is, in a sense, to mirror what is the correct way of doing, is quite different when an intention is that the intention is for something to perhaps emerge. And therefore, we just talked about levels in terms of at the movement level, but actually almost at the conceptual level, from the very discrete, the very specific, to the more emergent, the relationship then between the individuals becomes quite different. So for example, if this was about creative dance, it takes on a different, the notion of mimicry perhaps takes on a different something. Did I make sense there, or was that too?
Well, okay. So you're basically getting at the teacher is setting certain environmental constraints by which they are. So how can?
Well, I would even say that people come together, and when they come together to in essence copy what one person is doing, is at a very relatively simplistic level. Whereas if they come together with the intention of something that's a bit more emergent, acknowledging that they bring different things to the table, is that process maybe more complex, more complicated even? No, wrong words, but I know what I mean.
But yeah, I would say that in that situation where, for instance, the teacher is not giving a specific task that they need to do or a specific game, you have to obviously have some type of task constraint going on. I would say that the students bringing in different elements are going to produce different things based upon their groupings in and of themselves. So yeah, it becomes extremely complex, and that becomes an inhibitor towards, quantification of any of this research. That, that's why I've chosen kind of really discrete elements at this point. That the larger concepts, they become really complex once you start looking at some of the stuff that you were talking about.
And I think that's the really important part of the process here, that from a transdisciplinary perspective, which is something I'm reading about a lot at the moment, I think Louise said take context out of it. For some of us as teacher educators, that is almost impossible to do.
Yeah.
But it's then looking at how these principles transcend between, in a sense, the more lab-based type experience and the more, contextual real-world situations. And certainly from my previous life as a young PE student, being taught motor control stuff that had no relationship whatsoever with the world that I lived in. So I think what's interesting here is trying to find those similarities between the concepts that are driving what we're talking about and the different, in a sense, sub-disciplines that we're all interested in. And that's a really important part of this journey. And it means that some of the questions are slightly different, but the principles are probably pretty similar.
Yeah, absolutely. I would completely agree with that. Does anybody else have anything to say about that?
I'd like to say something. You use the metaphor of the conversation, and I think that's really interesting. Would I be wrong to say that conversation really is about a discussion that ends up with some sort of consensus? And sometimes this consensus really depends, because we're talking about affiliation and rapport. Perhaps the consensus sometimes could lean towards a more dominant participant of that conversation. Because of that social factor. Could it also be limited? I think someone brought it up just now. Could it also be limited by the skills, the ability level? And it also got me thinking about, this mimicry, when you use the example of your experiment, using the basketball. So you've got two students, and eventually they've got this bouncing rhythm that synchronize with each other. But was it because they were looking at each other, or they were hearing each other, and then they got into that rhythm? And in a game, because we discussed, or rather you all discussed about what happens in a game situation, would it count as a mimicry if, as a player, I've seen a really good action happen in another game that I've seen before, and then I want to mimic that action, not because I'm seeing it in my teammate, but because I saw it before? So yeah, just these thoughts running through my head. Okay. Oh, and one last one. Because I think the activity they were given was just a minute long. Would more people start to mimic each other if we gave them a longer period of time and over a few lessons within the same group? I was just wondering about those things.
Okay, I'll talk to that first one, the last comment about 1 minute. They had 3 trials of 1 minute. And interestingly enough, what we generally saw was less synchronization during the first trial, a little bit more during the second, and a huge amount during the third. So it could be conceptualized that over time, if we had a huge amount of time, not just 3 minutes, maybe they would work towards it. Maybe that person that was at a 0.7 would eventually work towards a 0.5. We don't know at this point. So yeah, that is probably something that is going to occur there. I'd like to talk about your idea of a consensus. I do like that idea of a consensus, and within complexity theory, we would say that's an attractor. That the consensus that they have come up with is working towards that attractor well. Now, they would have gotten to that attractor well probably by themselves over a long enough period of time. However, through this conversation, they're kind of creating leapfrogs. They're shortcutting over each other. And so, yeah, they do reach a consensus, and that consensus would be buried within an attractor well. Now, over time, we would expect certain learner tasks or environmental constraints to change in such a way that they would probably come out of that well. And that may be something where you would actually, if you mix up groups, that's going to create turbulence in the system, and you may be able to get that consensus to jump. But yeah, I like that idea of consensus, moving towards attractors and kind of coming up with a common motor solution. With rhythm, you were talking about the rhythm being just because they're watching somebody. And I think first of all, we took care of hearing. They were actually wearing earmuffs because we only wanted visual information. We only wanted information coming, because that's the literature had said that it's mainly visual information. And we had other people dribbling within the gymnasium. We didn't want any influence from them. So they wore earplugs and earmuffs, so they couldn't have any auditory signal during it, which obviously reduces the amount of ecological validity. But for our purposes, we wanted to see what it would do in this thing. So yeah, it was probably visual information. And within this example, it may have been some of their previous experience. How did they dribble? We did have one kid, he was a basketball player, obviously, because he dribbled in a very defensive, a very defensive stance where he had his arm up and he was really low to the ground. He was dribbling at almost 3 dribbles per minute. And what's interesting about him is towards the third trial, because they were all delineated. Towards the third trial, he actually switched from being at a 0.7 to about a 0.5 because he had gotten tired of being down in that defensive position. So now he went to a more upright to where he didn't have to work so hard. So yeah, he brought some of that previous experience in that, hey, this is how you dribble during basketball. But then you could actually see that he changed his pattern based upon the environment that he was in. So yeah, did I hit rhythm, attractors, and then 1 minute? Did you have another one?
I was thinking if mimicry could be extended to a previous observation of a game. So let's say I'm playing tennis and I see Serena hit a wonderful shot, and I'm thinking, hey, I think I can do that. And then the opportunity comes up when I'm playing with an opponent and I try to execute it. So would that count as a mimicry?
Yeah, and the interesting thing about mimicry is I take it from a constructivist point of view that some people think of mimicry as a direct exchange, that I see it and I can go ahead and replicate it. I view it as I'm only replicating within my own constraints, within my own learner constraints. So you see Serena do it, and then you try to replicate it. And maybe you have several attempts, and maybe you even get it to where it looks kind of what Serena's doing. I would say within your learner constraints, it probably isn't very much like hers. It may look like hers, but you're probably having to activate your body in a very specific way to get it to do that. And maybe yours isn't getting the same result. That may be a form of mimicry. That may be a form of mimicry we need to look at. But overall, that's how I would view that situation. That, yeah, you probably are mimicking. And that's definitely conscious mimicry. So you're consciously saying, I want to look like that. I'm going to try to replicate that. I'm more interested in the non-conscious nature. And what's really interesting about mimicry is one of the experiments, they actually looked at people that they did 2 things. First of all, they did a post-interview with the participants, and they showed them instances of mimicry. And they showed them, hey, you were mimicking here. And the people were honestly astounded that, hey, I was doing that. They didn't have any idea they were doing that. And then they had Confederates go in to certain situations and intentionally mimic somebody else. So they would go in and they would intentionally mimic the other person. And that way, what that caused the other person to do was attempt to disaffiliate. For some reason, if you're being mimicked and you know that somebody is mimicking you, if it's that overt that they are trying to mimic you, you have a disaffiliative response sometimes. For some reason, it needs to be very subtle. If it's any greater than being very subtle, then there's some negative consequences they've found. Now, that may not happen at all within our context. That's just some of the social psychology literature that's out there. But that's something we probably would need to look at.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
I've got to go soon.
Yeah, me too. I have to go teach. So, thank you guys, everybody, for attending. What I'm going to try to do is I'm going to set up this again for 30 days from now. We'll try to go on October 20th. I think that'll be a Friday. And we will try to rotate the time zones. So everybody that was kind of in the middle of the day, you may be in the morning next time.
No, I don't think you need to. No, it's fine. No, I don't.
It's fine.
The time zones are absolutely.
For Tim, it is not.
No, I do appreciate that.
We may rotate it a little bit.
My
But anyway,
Scottish humor.
what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to look for one of you to present. If anybody wants to present, just send me an email as soon as you can. We do need to work, because it's my pro account, I was able to share my screen fairly seamlessly. There may be something else that I have to do to get your screen share to work on your end. So we'll probably have to collaborate a little bit to get your screen share to go. But if you want to present next time and have a discussion, just let me know. If I don't hear from anybody, don't be surprised if I send you an email asking you if you'll present. But I really want to keep the momentum going on this. I'd like to be able to do this every 30 days and try to get it going. It lost some momentum before, just because, well, some of these times things lose momentum, but we're going to try to keep the momentum behind this and keep people presenting their stuff. And I really like that it amps up right before conference time. And that's kind of when this is going to become really useful, that we can kind of give dry runs on our presentations and see how they're going to be taken, give us some critical feedback, and that's how I envision this going.
Yep. Thanks, Jesse. Great.
Jesse, we are able to share our screens because I've got a control panel that's showing up at the bottom and it's got share there.
Awesome.
So I'm just going to try it out and see if all of you can have a look. So I've got,
yes.
Do you see? Yep. So we can share.
Excellent. Well, that solves that problem. Thank you, Joanne.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay. Well, I will see you guys in 30 days. You'll hear from me, and we'll probably use this same room. The room that you guys are on right now is actually my permanent room, so this one should be able to This should work every time.
Hey, well done. Enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you guys very much.
Thank you all.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for now.